In this video, I'd like to give a little bit of historical context to William Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And that's really all we're going to do. We're not going to talk about the poem itself so much, but we're going to talk about what inspired it and the kind of historical background that influenced its composition. So if we want to put some dates to this poem was first composed in 1804, but Wordsworth had seen the daffodils a couple years earlier already, so this is 1802. And it's interesting that he took a while before he actually wrote the poem. In 1807, he first published the poem in Poems in 2 volumes. That's what this book is called. And at that point, the poem had 3 stanzas. And in 1815, the final version was published, and that one has 4 stanzas. The second stanza has been added. So the 1815 version is the one we're familiar with. It's the one that's usually anthologized, and that's the one that we're studying. Okay, so that's the process of composition. Now, if we zoom out a little bit and we talk about what happened historically, then we can slot this poem into a particular historical movement, and we call this Romanticism. Specifically, we're talking about British Romanticism, the Romanticism of English literature. And conventionally, there are some dates given to this. So a lot of people start with the French Revolution, 1789, and then the ending date is often given as 1830 or 1832, when the Reform Act took place. So that is Romanticism, but obviously these are arbitrary dates. And I think if you're talking about European Romanticism more broadly, then you can expand these dates quite a bit on either side. But for English Romanticism, we typically provide these dates, and that kind of places Romanticism between the Enlightenment, when there was a lot of emphasis on rationalism, rationalism and kind of clear structure and order and so on, and then the Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria afterwards. The French Revolution, I've mentioned this event, and I think this is a really important event because it set the tone for what the Romantics believed in. And if we look at the French Revolution slogan here, the slogan was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. So liberty, equality, and brotherhood, fraternity, right? The reason I bring this up is because people were willing to do revolutionary things for these values, for individualism, for our common brotherhood, for our own rights, okay? And they would storm the Bastille, that's a famous event, for instance. They wanted to kill the king. They also attacked many of the values of the church because they wanted a radical kind of freedom. And I think that's one of the values of Romanticism that we should really be aware of. So a kind of radical freedom. But we can make a little list of other values as well. And maybe we'll zoom out a little bit here. So what are some values of Romanticism? Well, there's increasingly a focus on the individual. The individual matters, and the individual has rights, and we should protect those. Those are rights to vote, rights to think freely and not be oppressed. And because we have this constant focus on the individual, as well as our common humanity, obviously, that then leads to a kind of revolutionary politics. But it also leads to a really strong emphasis on subjectivity, on everything that makes us individual. And that means that we focus on our emotions. Our emotions matter, which again goes against the kind of rationalism of the Enlightenment, which is more focused on reason, although there's a lot of continuity too. And the Romantics are not saying that emotions are more important than reason, but that emotions should be part of the picture. And in fact, the greatest mental faculty, according to the Romantics, is the imagination. And the imagination has a kind of creative aspect to it. We remake the world through our imagination. And that's an incredible thing that we can do. And of course, that makes the poet such a powerful figure because the poet has the strongest imagination. So that makes us more subjective then. We can also say more spontaneous. Because if we are in touch with our emotions, then we will spontaneously express them. And that is then our authentic self, right? We have this concept of the authentic or the true self that the Romantics wanted to discover. But where can you find the authentic self? Well, the Romantics said in nature. We want to turn to nature to find out who we truly are. And we can see the connection then between the individual and nature. If you want to find out who you are individually, you need to kind of sequester yourself from society. You need to draw yourself out to find yourself. And where can you do that best? Well, in nature. And I think you can probably see that all of these values are in Wordsworth's poem, because he says, well, if I want to be myself, when I need to be solitary, lonely as a cloud, in the bliss of solitude, and then I can truly find who I am, and then I can be passionate and express myself and have these emotional kinds of highs, and that happens in nature. And nature then is often described as kind of semi-divine. It has a religious aspect. It puts you in touch with the divine spirit that's out there and that is in you as well. So there is a kind of pantheism to Romanticism, this idea that God is in everything, right? And that goes again against the conventional sense of religion, because the true temple, the true church, is in nature and it's not in an actual building. Okay, so that gives us some background to Romanticism, and we can see this expressed in many places. And I have a quotation here from the Ode to Joy, this poem by Friedrich Schiller, and this poem became the basis of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony, which was completed in 1824, just to give the date here. The fourth movement is the Ode to Joy, this kind of choral piece. And notice this line in there, Alle Menschen werden Brüder. So all people become or shall become brothers. We are all brothers. We have something in common, which is the fact that we are human, that we're on the same level, that we have this equality, we have fraternity, and because of these things, we should have a kind of radical freedom. Notice that the Ode to Joy also starts with this concept of joy, Freude, right? We have this radical joy, and when Schiller writes the poem, he refers to this joy as kind of the sparks of divinity, the divine thing that is in all of us, which is Freude or joy. And when Wordsworth turns to nature, what does he find? He finds that the flowers are gay, they are happy, they are jocund, right, cheerful. He finds an incredible joy, and it's that joy, that passionate feeling that makes us human. So we can start to see a lot of things coming into focus then. Wordsworth's poem is written during this period, and it's a typical kind of romantic poem in the sense that it expresses a strong sense of spontaneous emotion. Earlier, in 1798, Wordsworth had already published the Lyrical Ballads, and this important composition includes many of his most famous poems, but it also includes his kind of theoretical expression of what poetry is. And I have a quotation here from the Lyrical Ballads. So this passage reads, "The principal object, then, which I proposed to myself in these poems was to make the incidents of common life interesting by tracing in them truly, though not ostentatiously," right? So kind of realistically, but not in a showy manner, not showing off, the primary laws of our nature, chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. Notice this kind of passion that comes through. And then if we are passionate, how do our mental faculties work? So you can see a radical interest in consciousness, and that's very common with Romantic poets. Where does he go to find this kind of passionate expression? Well, he says we should focus on low and rustic life, and that's because that's where people express themselves most naturally, most directly. So find some kind of pastoral scene, some kind of rustic picture, and look at farmers, look at shepherds, look at people who are willing just to talk in a way that's natural and straightforward. This is very common with Romantic writers, this notion to what's simplistic, what is almost naive, what is direct. And nature, the rustic, this is the place where we can find this best. We want to move away from what's artificial, and it's society that's artificial. In fact, we also have to remember that during this period we have the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution and capitalism and so on. And the Romantic writers are often very much against this. They see the cities becoming grimy and dirty, and they turn to nature as a kind of escape or as a way to find yourself truly. So we see in this poetic program then a lot of Romantic values. And we also have a little bit later in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, we have Wordsworth's most famous description of what poetry is then. He says, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility." That's definitely what Wordsworth did, because of course he took 2 years before he actually decided to write the poem. That's the tranquility. But it is also the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And the poet then is often seen as a passive kind of person who is willing to open himself up to nature, and then nature overtakes him. It just allows his feelings to fully come out. There's a kind of courage in that, right? You're not trying to constrain yourself, but you open yourself up. And then the imagination is the more active part, because the imagination, as Wordsworth would later add to the preface as well, he says, okay, I try to be realistic, but there's also a kind of coloring of the imagination whenever I depict nature. So the imagination adds something. It doesn't just reflect what is out there. And that's where the imagination is that really crucial faculty. Okay, so that's the kind of historical background. Let's focus now more specifically then on what caused Wordsworth to write this poem specifically. I mentioned that Wordsworth first saw the daffodils in 1802, and he wrote about them in 1804. It's wonderful that we have this description from Dorothy Wordsworth's diary, from her journals. And Dorothy Wordsworth was William Wordsworth's sister, and they actually went for a walk together, and they were walking in the Lake District of England. So if you look at this kind of rough graphic here, the Lake District is quite a ways up England, and it's almost in Scotland, and that basically gives you a sense of roughly where it is. So in the Lake District, Wordsworth was going for a walk with his sister, and she describes the scene. I've underlined a few words to really indicate how much Wordsworth borrows in his poem. I'm going to let you read this description yourself. It's quite a beautiful description in itself, and it also has that kind of breathless aspect. She just can't stop. Most of these are run-on sentences. She's so excited she wants to share this, and you see this kind of natural and spontaneous overflow of emotions. So Dorothy and William shared a lot of values in common when it came to the way they saw nature. But you can see many of the same things being described in Wordsworth's poem. The dancing, the tossing, the kind of long belt or line of flowers along the shore, the trees, the fact that they have heads, the personification, the word gay is there, the laughing. I mean, so much of Wordsworth's poem is actually right in this description. And that's remarkable, and it's kind of interesting then that he leaves her out of it. She's not in the poem. It becomes this really solitary poem, which is kind of bizarre, isn't it? Why did he do that? Well, I think that's maybe something to investigate and think about. So if you look at the poem then, I've just underlined a few phrases here as well. Especially in the first couple of stanzas, you see how much is shared here in many of these phrases. His wife, Mary, contributed a couple of lines as well. Probably the most famous lines, she came up with these two lines. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And that is Mary's contribution, as Wordsworth pointed out. So that's the poem. The last thing maybe to talk about briefly is how it was received. And you might be surprised there, because we admire the poem, most of us do, and it's very famous now. It's Wordsworth's most famous poem, and it's seen as representative of romantic expression. But at first, people were a little bit underwhelmed by it. And one thing they pointed out was that the daffodils don't seem to be a worthy subject for this kind of powerful expression. So Wordsworth really goes all out, and he describes the daffodils in such epic terms that some people were shaking their heads at the time. Even Wordsworth's friend, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, even though he admires Wordsworth and he wrote a lot with him, they published together in Lyrical Ballads, Coleridge criticized Wordsworth for the poem. He actually called this poem an example of mental bombast. Mental bombast. Being bombastic is being loud and noisy, a lot of show, but not much of actual importance. And he says what this poem does is it's a great example of kind of intellectual and imaginative furor, you might say, expression, but there's little substance to it. It's all about the mind, and what happens in the mind doesn't actually match up the reality because they're just a bunch of daffodils. And what we should really dedicate this kind of epic description to is virtue, a virtuous life, somebody's biography maybe, actual action, but not this kind of description of a bunch of flowers. So a lot of criticism at the time, but it gives you a sense that the poem is somewhat revolutionary in many ways, okay? Because it is expressing a new feeling. It's expressing an imaginative sympathy for nature, and that romantic feeling is still new and controversial.